Hey everyone, this is Baphometrix, and this is going to be the first in a long series of tutorial videos about the digital audio workstation called Bitwig. Um, a lot of producers who really love Ableton Live might not even be aware that this DAW exists, but some of us who have used it extensively and really understand the differences and similarities between Bitwig and Ableton Live think that Bitwig is a better live than live. And I'm going to try and explain why. uh, so unlike other tutorial videos about Bitwig, a lot of the way I'm going to talk about it is always going to be in relation to Ableton Live. I've been an Ableton user since version 6. I still used Ableton right up through version 10 and did quite a few projects in 10. But I recently switched to Bitwig for a variety of reasons that I hope to explain to you and maybe get you a little excited about Bitwig. There's some misinformation about Bitwig out there, and I hope to dispel that. So the way that this is going to work, this video is going to focus on like a 5,000 foot overview of Bitwig, comparing and contrasting it to Ableton, and it's going to be kind of a whirlwind tour where I'm going to touch briefly on a lot of features and points, but not really go deep into them. The deep dives are going to come in later videos in this series, and I'm going to be putting out a lot of those really quick over the next month or so. So in this first video, I'm going to focus on a section in this handbook that I've written down near the bottom called Pros and Cons of Bitwig versus Ableton, and also briefly touch on these three sections at the bottom that goes into some really heavy compare and contrast of Bitwig features against Ableton features. By the way, pardon the noise in the background. I work in a noisy room, and yes, you can produce in a noisy room. I'm proof of that. But anyway, this document is a Google Doc. It's a living doc. I constantly update it. I kind of built it for myself, actually, when I was really learning Bitwig, and then I thought, well, this would be really useful to show everyone else, too, as a way to wrap their head around Bitwig and maybe get used to Bitwig as they migrate over from Ableton. So I'm going to make a link to this available in the comments for the video, and you can come back to this at any time, read it in detail, and go from there. So again, I'm going to focus on sections at the bottom for this one. And the main thing I'm going to do is go over the top 12 pros or reasons why you might want to move to Bitwig and compare those against the cons or the things you would lose if you move to Bitwig. And then there's 3 more sections at the bottom that I'll briefly touch on that talk about the cool, interesting Bitwig features that Ableton doesn't have, and conversely, the cool Ableton features that Bitwig doesn't have, and finally, the features that are in both DAWs and are pretty much exactly the same, right? Because in many ways, a DAW is a DAW is a DAW, okay? So before I dive into this stuff, and I'm not just going to read through it and make you sit here while I read through it, I'm going to go back and point at things in the Bitwig interface while I do that. And I'm just going to touch on those points briefly. So before I get to that, though, I really want to touch on the first thing that I hear a lot about Bitwig. There's a lot of misunderstanding out there. I commonly hear the refrain that Bitwig is just for Euro-rack nerds. Bitwig is just for like experimental electronic musicians. It's not really for other types of music. I mean, it's just for Euro-rack stuff. That's all it's for. And that's so not true. I mean, you can produce any kind of music in any DAW. Let's be clear about that. And it is true that Ableton and its workflow and its features is very attractive to producers in the electronic genres and the heavy festival genres, the heavy broken beat EDM genres, and stuff like that. Whereas, if you're doing film scoring, you're probably going to like Logic a lot because it has a lot of great film scoring features. Or if all you do is hip hop or other genres of music that aren't electronic, you might really like Studio One. It's a great DAW for traditional types of music, right? But Ableton Live has always had, for people that move over to Ableton Live or start in Ableton Live, one of the things about Live that we all love are the crazy racks you can build, the very complex, deep, detailed racks. And I just want to make really clear in that regard, Bitwig is identical and even way better and deeper and more flexible and more crazy. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later in this video. But the point is, Bitwig and Ableton have very similar structure and workflow. We've got the device chains here at the bottom that have all kinds of nested device groups and VSTs and parallel chains and all kinds of stuff. You do all that in Bitwig too, and it looks a little different on the surface, but it's the same basic idea. And you have this device kind of view. You have all the same features of Ableton with a few differences, like Bitwig has this notion of an inspector panel that you can do lots of detailed editing in when you're on, for example, a specific clip. There's all kinds of things you can do to the clip here instead of having to like open up the clip down in this area of the window. So it's a little different in this regard, but pretty much in terms of the interface up here and the channel strip down here for all your devices and having some kind of browser pane and having a clip launcher kind of mode that you can use for live performance or as a tool for creative composing, stuff like that, groups within groups, all that stuff. Bitwig actually had groups within groups before Ableton. That was one of the things that the Ableton devs tried to catch up with Bitwig on. So it's very similar in many ways. If you really know Ableton well, the migration to Bitwig is simple. But anyway, let's go back to the contention that somehow Bitwig is only for electronic musicians. That's just so not true. I'm going to play you a snippet of one of my most recent songs. This hasn't been released yet, so I'm just going to give you a short snippet, but it's a heavy festival-oriented banger, and just so you can hear this real quick.
My name is Baphometrix. My name is Baphometrix. My name is Baphometrix. I bring you the message. What you say to that? Yeah, you say yes to stress. Don't need no whips, no. Don't need no chain, no. I make that sound that get into your brain. My name is Baphometrix. I bring you the message. Baphometrix. I bring you the message. Don't need no whips, no. Don't need no chain, no. I make that sound that get into your brain. Baphometrix. No. Baphometrix. No. My name is Baphometrix.
Okay, so you've heard enough of that. I was scrolling through my sidechain group, and the reason you see some of these sidechain devices showing no input is because this is a master this is a pre-master project that everything's been bounced down to audio, so there was no need for the sidechain anymore because I bounced that in. But we'll get into all that in a little bit. It's got this big pretty mixer view that's very easy on the eyes, easy to work with. And as you can hear, you can make very heavy dubsteppy, whatever you want to call it, music in here. So let's just jump into the items on the list real quick and roll through them real fast. So again, I'm not going to really go into real detail about any of these. I'm just going to touch on these points to give you a big overview and set up the forthcoming videos. For example, my very next video is going to talk about this point number 1 here, and it's going to go into a lot of detail about this. And then I'm just going to walk through this list and probably put out a video for every one of these. So the way that I like to think of Bitwig when I'm explaining it to somebody who is really familiar with Ableton is you have to think of Bitwig in terms of what you'll gain versus what you'll lose by migrating to it. And so one of the questions someone might ask is, well, what's the killer feature of Bitwig? What's the thing that I just absolutely must have Bitwig for, right? That I can't do at all in Ableton. And the answer to that is that there isn't really a solid one, oh my God, must have killer feature. There's 2 features that are almost killer, and they're the top 2 on the list. But could you live without these? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ableton will get the job done. The way that I think of Bitwig is it's more like there's tons of strong features or nice features or desirable features that when you add them all together, like when you add all 12 of these together, that paints a really compelling picture, okay? It's just once you get used to Bitwig and you're working in Bitwig, I guarantee you the workflow is faster, everything's easier and more intuitive. There's just so many things. Let me put it this way. Every time I go back to Bitwig to work on an old project or I'm sorry, every time I go back to Live to work on an old project, I grit my teeth. I like go, oh God, I'm back to dealing with this thing again. And oh, this takes forever and stuff like that. So it's a bunch of little things that add up. That's the main thing about Bitwig. So what are they? Well, first of all, in Ableton, the browser is kind of like a file manager in a file system. It's like Windows Explorer or whatever the Macintosh OXS equivalent is. Finder, I think they call it. It's been a while since I worked in Mac systems. So, in Ableton, you create folders and subfolders and subfolders, and, all your presets are in a folder or a subfolder, and you have to name the folders really well and have a really consistent organization and structure to them, or it's just really hard to find stuff. Like in Ableton's browser, yes, there's a search, but half the time you don't remember the name of that rack you made, or you don't remember where the name of a specific sample you want. You just kind of know roughly where it is in your sample library's file structure. So you do a lot of clicking and drilling into folders in Ableton's browser. And it's just slow to find stuff. It really is. Now, by contrast, Bitwig's browser is this, it's got all the same basic top-level categories. There's devices, presets, samples, multi-samples, WAV files and MP3 files and FLACs and AIFs and stuff that are on your file system, like all your reference tracks are within easy reach. It's got a whole system for clips, and clips could be all kinds of things, including like track clips. These are group clips here. These are entire groups, just like in Ableton. And then finally, you can just literally browse through your file system. So far, this is all very much like Ableton, right? But then we start getting into the differences, and it has to do with this top half of the window that is all these different types of tags and categories. Like these are manually created collections that I can manually assign things to. These 3 things at the bottom are automatic collections. They're kind of like smart playlists in iTunes. And so, for example, all of my plugins that are VST3 are in this folder. And every time I add a new VST3 plugin, it's just automatically added to this folder. Here's all my VST2 plugins. Here's all the devices that are specific to Bitwig itself. Here's a bunch of folders, or rather, I should say, collections I made. They're like virtual folders. They're not really physical folders. They're just containers that I made, and then I can add things to these. And so if I want any of my various devices that are for glitching or motion or pitch, they're here. If I want anything that has to do with mixing and mastering, they're here. metering, stuff like that. And again, this isn't all of my VSTs. These are just the ones I use a lot. Like these are just some of my mixing and mastering VSTs in here. You can duplicate things like the same plugin might be useful in the context of mixing and mastering, and it might also just be an EQ that you reach for. And so, you know, it might be in two different places here. Whereas again, in Ableton, there's just one place that any given plugin lives, and you have to remember where it is or scroll through your whole huge list of plugins. You can also look at your plugins by where they're located on your file system. You can look at plugins by high-level categories that are automatically assigned by Bitwig. Honestly, I don't find this that useful, so I don't use it that much. And this is pretty cool. Plugins by creator. And again, I'm filtered down to just EQs and filters. So let me remove that filter and let's go look at creator again. So here's all the different vendors of all my different plugins. You want to go find all your Waves plugins? There you go. You want to go find all your plugins by Sound Toys? There you go, and so on. So it's just a really fast way to deal with your stuff when you've got all this different level of categorization and tagging. Presets. So these are like racks. These are racks that I've built. And in fact, I have a collection I've made that's just my stuff, and it's an automatically made smart collection, like a iTunes smart playlist. So every time I create a new playlist, preset of some sort, some new rack or some new multi-sample or some new sampler instrument, and I save it to my user library, it just automatically shows up in this folder. So I never have to go, where's all my stuff? It's in one list. And once I'm here filtering it, if this list had hundreds of things in it, I could just search for some keyword I used and instantly find it quickly. Whereas in Ableton, I'd spend a lot more time digging around for stuff. So that's all I'm going to show you about the browser today. My next video will go into a lot more, it'll go into a lot more detail about it. I do want to show you one more thing. Let's say I have a certain rack, like this one called leads, sit on top. You can make really long, detailed comments about how to use the rack, what it does, how to set it up, because, you know, sometimes there's racks we only use every now and then, and you don't really remember all the details about the different things in it you have to configure. So you can make really long descriptions for your racks, and that becomes part of the rack in the user library. Like all of my racks, I have a description of what it does and how to set it up. So if I ever pass these racks along to a friend or sell them, you know, it's like the documentation goes with the rack. How many times have you, I don't know, downloaded racks from Ill Gates or Seth Gates or somebody who likes to make crazy racks and give them away? And then you open up the rack and you go, what does this do? I don't know what this does. You know, it's hard to reverse engineer racks in Ableton, but here the person who built the rack could like describe the rack in a paragraph or two, and there it is, right in your browser. So browser to me is kind of a killer feature. At first, I was like, yeah, okay, this is nice. But the more I use Bitwig, the more I realize how powerful this browser is. And everything's faster to find and easier to find. And every time I go back to Ableton, I'm like, oh my God, where is this in the browser again? And what does this do? And I feel the loss. Okay, the next thing that Bitwig is really important for, and probably what many people would consider the killer feature of Ableton, is its rack system. Okay, I could go into so much detail here, but I won't. The basic thing with let me find an empty track and just drop something on an emptier track here. Come on, I have something that's empty. Okay, there we go. So when you add devices, like by default, this is bringing up different kinds of devices. So let me just bring in a couple things like a compressor. You have your knobs in the UI, and in Ableton, you can automate these knobs. You know, you can click a knob and that selects it for automation, and you have a way that you can start creating automation lanes for a knob and so on. You can do all that in Bitwig too. I mean, like as I select each one of these knobs, if you look down here, you can see it's becoming highlighted at the top. And if I were to go into an automation lane for this, you can see that as I select knobs, it becomes the selected thing in that automation lane, and I could start drawing automation points on it and doing various things to automate that knob. Okay, very much like Ableton so far, no difference. Where it gets crazy is in terms of its modulator system, where there are like 32 roughly different modulators, and they add new ones all the time. Everything from LFOs to randomizers to sample and holds to various kinds of step sequence modulators to audio side chains and audio rate and envelope followers and just crazy, crazy oscillators. XY modulators that'll crossfade between things. Tons of stuff. And when you add any one of these things to a rack, like let me add the LFO there, and let me add a random here, and let me add a note counter here. Okay, I now have 3 modulators attached to just a regular VST of no consequence. And I could take something like this compressor threshold knob and bring it to the top of this little selector here, and I could take this LFO modulator and modulate the threshold a little bit. And now you can see it actually visually responding to the LFO modulator. I can do all kinds of configuration on the LFO modulator. I can speed it up, slow it down, change its shape a little bit, change its shape even more. Okay, do all kinds of crazy things, mess with its phase, make it synced, free, whatever, make it bipolar or unipolar, just tons of stuff like that. Same deal with the random modulator. You've got all sorts of ways to control random. The note modulator, the note counter can increment things and do things as it walks through every MIDI note that hits it. Just these are 3 of the many modulators, and I can literally modulate anything in a plugin or device. I can even use certain modulators to modulate other modulators. Yeah, think about that for a minute. Like I can take this random modulator, and with it, I can modulate the LFO rate of the LFO. And I can come over here and mess around with the random modulator, like speed it up a little bit. And we come back here to the LFO, and you can see the LFO's starting position for its own rate is now being jumped around by the random modulator. So this is as far as I'm going to go here, but it gets crazy. It's crazy the racks you can build and the kind of movement you can impart to your tracks through these racks. The other thing about Bitwig that's very unique compared to Ableton is its shortcut macros aren't just knobs. You also have buttons and selectors and all kinds of stuff. And even better, you can create multiple shortcuts for any given preset that you save in your user library. And you can assign anything you want to these. And so you can literally, from a single instance of your preset, you could have like you're not limited to just 8 macro knobs like in Ableton, but you can literally have 8, 16, I'm sorry, let's go this way, 8. Oh, there's a couple presets that are there that are different. 2, 3, so I've got 4 different shortcut pages here for this one thing that all have different controls on them for one preset. And these are all just like shortcut macros that are mapped to various things in the device. So it's incredible. It's a very, very strong system. That's as far as I'm going to go on that today, but it's mouth-watering. So a lot of people consider this to be the killer feature. I think between the browser and the racks, you could easily argue that those are the killer features of Bitwig. Now, the rest of these aren't nearly as impressive, but they're still really good. I think that it's all the quality of life workflow shortcuts that really speed up your workflow. It's little things that are all over the interface. Let's see if I can find an example. So with automation lanes, right? Automation lanes in Live are great. They're powerful. They're also messy. They're kind of hard to find automation lanes you made unless you lock them into like pinned automation rows. If you forget to do that, if you just make some automation in a new track somewhere like here, if I start creating automation and doing whatever. Okay, and if I go and select something else to automate, wait, am I on the right one? Yeah. If I go select something else to automate, well, you can forget that that one existed, right? Like, where is it in Ableton? And you have to go dig through here and do things. And it's hard sometimes to find automation you forgot about or to know what automation is on a track. But Bitwig has this one little button that if you click it, it just automatically finds everything that's been automated and just displays it. Right? So like here, I never worry about losing track of my automation again. It's like, where's my automation? There it is. That's all my automation, right? Little things like that. They're just throughout the entire interface. There are tons of shortcut keys in the settings. This is crazy. This will drive you, you'll be bewildered by this at first. It will seem intimidating. These are all the possible operations, or most of them, not necessarily all of them. And you can assign your own custom shortcut keys to almost anything. You can change the default shortcut keys so you can make Bitwig work the way you want it to. Like, for example, I like to be able to quickly, no matter where I'm zoomed in the interface, right? If I'm zoomed in or looking at some section, I say, I want to hear my drop. And if I know that my drop is, location marker 6, right? No matter where I am in the song, I can be way over here. I could have been working on this clip and doing things here. But if I want to just start playback from my cue marker number 6, I set up shortcuts to do Shift 6, and now I'm playing that. Or if I want to play the start of my breakdown, I can do Shift 7. Okay, and it's a little thing. It's a tiny thing, but it's one of those things that when you add it up with all the other little things, it becomes a huge thing. So all the automation stuff is quality of life, workflow shortcuts to me are very important. Other little things, turning on and off the various windows and panes. Like I can literally hide my browser in the bottom device channel that quickly. I can show all my automation racks or make them all go away. You can do this in Ableton too, although not many people take advantage of it, using Control and Alt modifiers to scroll and zoom, or if you're zoomed in to scroll sideways. It's very fast, it's very responsive. I made a shortcut key to zoom out to my whole project again. I made a shortcut key that if my playhead's over here and I want to go home, I can just press one shortcut key and I know that I'm back to 1.1.0 in my playhead. Just tons and tons and tons of little things like that. D is my device chain window. A is my automation lane window. E is my clip editing window for MIDI clips or audio clips. Oh, this is a cool thing too. Let's go to this track and let's just pick one of these clips. So I'm looking at one specific clip here, right? Actually, let's pick a track that has different clips in it. I'm looking at this specific clip right here that I've highlighted. If I want to see a different clip, I just click it. If I want to see a different clip, I just click it. It automatically jumps me to whatever clip I collect. Little things like that that are a bit harder, a bit slower, a bit more clunky in live. Sorry about that. Flipping between different views of, the windows you tend to use a lot. Look at this huge editing window. Just little things like that they start adding up over time. All right, next thing on the list. Automation and exact values. This drives us all crazy in Ableton. You're in a lane, you're trying to do some very tricky automation to something. And all you want to do is take a certain point, like these 2 points right here, and you just want to set them to an exact value. You want to nudge them down by 3 dB or 5% or whatever, right? In Ableton, there's no way to do that except by grabbing the point and moving it as slowly as possible and trying to hit the exact value you want. A lot of us will sit here and do something like make the automation lane as large as possible so your mouse movement will have a little bit more granularity. Well, you don't have to do that. You don't have to mess with that at all in Bitwig. You can just select the points you want and then come over here and set an exact value, 79%. Now I've changed it to an exact value. Or you can just manually drag this up and down and find the exact value you want. You can select a bunch of automation clips. I'm going to start messing up my project here, and I can just slide them all over by exact increments of beats and bars, even though my grid isn't on that same level of granularity. This is going exactly one beat at a time with each drag of my mouse. Just little things like that that are incredible. So much more granularity than you have in Ableton. So automation's a joy in Bitwig. The ability to have multiple projects open at the same time and to easily move clips, tracks, groups, and devices between them. So this is kind of a bounced down pre-master project that's all been flattened to audio, but I could go back to an earlier version of the project, like this demo was my original MIDI. So, you know, let's say I'm working in a later stage of a project, everything's been flattened to audio, but I decide, you know, I really messed up on this one track. I need to go back and kind of tweak something in the original MIDI and rebounce it to audio and bring it back over to my new track. Well, here's the original, the last version of the product that still had a lot of MIDI in it. It's open at the same time as my current mastering project, right? Let's say I want to make a change to this one pattern for my sub. It's a MIDI pattern. I double click it, there's the MIDI for it. Let's say I need to make a tiny change to it, or maybe I want to make a change to the, you know, some aspect of the sampler that it was in. Change its tone or timbre or behavior a little bit. So I can come in here, I could, I'm not even worried about doing it on my original track because I'm not going to save changes I make at this point, but I could come in here and actually do something like, I don't know, change the envelope on this sub bass. And then I could just right click this clip and say, okay, helps if I have the clip selected correctly. Wait, what the hell's going on here? Won't you let me bounce? Trying to think what's going on here. Oh, it's because the audio engine isn't on. Well, I don't want to turn on the audio engine because it'll take about 1.5 minutes to load this project because there's so many VSTs in it. So we'll just pretend this particular clip right here was a MIDI clip. Let's pretend this was a MIDI clip. Oh God, is it going to let me bounce this one? No, unless I turn the audio engine, it's not going to bounce. Well, screw it. You can hang with me for a minute. So you can have many projects open, but only one can have the audio engine open at a given time. And when you flip to that project and activate the audio engine, the main thing that takes time to load, and this is why Ableton projects take so long to load, is in the background, it's loading up all your plugins. It's loading all the VSTs, all the devices. It's kind of indexing them and doing things like that. Now, it's still indexing a lot of things in this project and loading them up, but I can see that my Moog sampler has already been loaded, right? So I can probably bounce this one now. So let's do it. I made changes to it. I'm going to bounce it. It says, you know, what bit depth do you want? The pre-fader signal, the post-fader signal? Do you want it dithered or not? Whatever. I'll just take a pre-fader signal. And, oh, okay, it is an empty bounce because the audio engine isn't fully loaded yet. I thought it would bounce it, but I'm going to have to wait until the whole thing loads. Let's just delete that audio track. Sorry, I picked a big project with lots of plugins in it. This got up to about 1.5 minutes load time. The same project in Ableton would probably have taken about 2.5 minutes to load. Bitwig's a little faster about loading even VSTs and stuff. Okay, so now it finally, I don't know why I did that bounce to new track thing. That was queued up from when I did the bounce. Okay, so anyway, so here I am. I'm in here. I made changes to MIDI. I'm going to bounce it to a new track. And here's my bounced clip that it just created below. And now I could take this bounced clip and grab it, drag it, bring it over here and hover my mouse over the tab for my live mastering project, come back down in here, drop it onto my subtrack wherever I wanted, and now I've got a new bounce of that thing. Maybe I could overwrite this one, right? And then activate the audio engine, come back here and keep working. So how long would it have taken to do that in Ableton, right? To actually get a bounce out of another project. You can't open two things at the same time in Ableton, so you have to close one project, open the other project, find the thing you want, save it, bounce it, export it as a stem, close that project, open up your other project, come over and load the stem in. Little things like that. It's actually really convenient sometimes to just come back here and maybe you don't even activate the audio engine and wait on that. You saw how fast it loaded, but you might just want to say, well, now what did I do there again? Or what synth did that come from? What did I use for this particular patch here? Oh yeah, that was this synth here. Okay. And what was that setting? And you know, sometimes you just want to look at another project. You don't necessarily want to grab things out of that project. You just want to look for reference. So it's really nice being able to have multiple projects open at the same time. Bitwig's great for that. Okay, next point. So I kind of touched on that a little bit, but the fast startup and project loading times. Let's just kill both of these projects off. Yeah, close you. I don't want to save changes. Close you. No, I don't want to save changes. So this mastering project, how long did it take to load? Click. So the project file itself is there right away. I can start looking at tracks, seeing what they're made of, right? Looking at the devices on those tracks. I can do all that while it's still loading the VSTs into the audio engine. Okay, so that's how fast you can get to the project information itself. And then the entire load of this track, the whole track probably takes about, this track takes about 25 seconds to load. I mean, I routinely have Ableton projects that were 3-minute load times, or at least 2.5-minute load times. That's common in Ableton. So I love the snappy way that Bitwig loads up. And more importantly, it's got a separation in Bitwig between the project file and all the plugins and the audio engine. So what happens is most of the time, if a plugin crashes in Bitwig, all that happens is the audio engine, you'll get a crash message that a plugin has crashed and your project will look like this. And it'll even give you a box up here like restart the audio engine to reload the plugins. So most of the time, if something goes foobar and crashes, you don't lose your window, you don't lose your project, you don't lose the progress you had made, right? Like if I had a crash and it ended up in this state, I could just go, oh crap, okay, before I do anything else, just let me save my project. And I could do a quick save. And then I could say, okay, go ahead and reload the plugins. And boom. So it's very friendly about crashes. And if for some reason the entire project itself crashes and Bitwig itself crashes, you know how in Ableton, when you reload Ableton, after a crash, it nags you, hey, here's a crash file over in this folder, send it to us. And you have to go compose an email, find that file, drag it into the email to attach it. Why? Why do they do that? In Bitwig, if Bitwig actually fully crashes, which is super, super rare, when Bitwig comes back up and restores the project, it says, hey, I crashed. Would you just tell me what you were doing when it crashed and click a send button? And then it actually sends the report automatically. And it's just right there in the interface. So just little things like that. Another thing about the architecture that's interesting in this respect are how it does plugins. So Bitwig supports both 32-bit and 64-bit plugins at the same time. It also supports VST2 and VST3. I might be talking about this later, but the basic idea is it's even got different ways of sandboxing all your plugins. Like you could say, well, just make one sandbox for all my 32-bit plugins and another sandbox for all my 64-bit plugins. so that if a 32-bit plugin crashes, like I have an old Camel Fat or something in here, and it crashes, it's only going to crash the other 32-bit plugins. It's not going to touch my 64-bit plugins that are up and running in the project. Or you can be really crazy and say, sandbox every single plugin. If I were to select certain plugins that are troublemakers, like if I have a plugin that crashes all the time on me, let's say, for example, let's say I use Arcade, and Arcade was a crashy plugin, and I knew it was a crashy plugin. I could pick just this one plugin out of my entire list and click this button here. And then what I'm telling Bitwig is every time you use this plugin, put it in its own little sandbox so that if it crashes, it doesn't crash all the other plugins. And then when I click the Restart Audio Engine button, it only has to reload that one Arcade plugin to get the project up and running again, right? So really, really flexible architecture and really flexible sandboxing of your project versus your plugins, and even sandboxing and protecting plugins from each other. So you can isolate troublemaker plugins that always screw up on you. That's a pretty nice feature. Okay. Sidechain routing. Yeah, this one, some might call this a killer feature. Sidechaining in Ableton is a pain in the butt. In Ableton, everything is a push kind of model for sidechaining. And what I mean by that is, if I want to take a kick drum that's on a drum track and I want that to drive the sidechain trigger on a compressor over in a different group here, like this one, in Ableton, you have to start at the drum track and then play with its routing there and say, okay, I want you to push this signal into some specific VST and some specific input channel on that VST over in a different track. And it's kind of confusing sometimes, especially for this. I love this plugin called Track Spacer, but in Ableton, this is a real pain in the butt to set up the sidechain routing for. Because it's hard to tell inside Track Spacer, like, now which one of those weirdly named channels is the sidechain input? You know, when you're over here on a different track trying to figure out which one to push it into. Okay, so it's a little confusing in Ableton, and some sidechain routing is difficult. In Bitwig, by contrast, whenever you drop in a device that has some sort of sidechain input, like let's just pull in a FabFilter Pro MB here. Okay, so Pro MB has a sidechain input, and any kind of VST you pull in that can take a sidechain natively, like it's built to have a sidechain inside it, will have this little drop-down arrow that lets you select the sidechain input. It's like Bitwig knows if it accepts a sidechain, it gives you the selector, and then you can go to a specific track and drill into even like this drum track is actually running drums out of a synth called VPS Avenger. And I have an internal drum machine inside of VPS Avenger. And here are the individual channel outs for all the drums. Like this is the bass drum, the rim shot, the snare, the clap, and so on. And I've got all my percussion grouped onto this bus, and I've got all my cymbals grouped onto this bus. So if I want the kick drum to be a snare trigger for this multi-band compressor, I can choose, do you want the pre-mixer signal or the post-mixer signal inside of, yeah, it's just crazy. And so I pick one of these, and now I have my sidechain input routed. It's that simple. It's like a pull model. From anything you want to sidechain, you just say, now where do you want that to come from? And you go find it, and it's much easier than the other way around. The other cool thing is this. Let's say I have a random VST. Let's just grab a general filter. Okay, let me scroll over here so we can see the filter. Now let's say, for whatever reason, I wanted my snare drum from a drum track to trigger this filter, and every time the snare hit, the filter opens up. Boom, 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 right? So how do you do that in Ableton? Oh, you can't. But in Bitwig, you can. So here's how you would do it in Bitwig. There's a special modulator called Audio Sidechain. And when I open up that modulator to look at its details, you can see it's just like setting up a sidechain filter in something like FabFilter Pro C. You've got the ability to pick where you want the input to come from. So let's go to a drum track. Let's go find a snare drum like that one. And then I can use these filter controls to like narrow down which part of that snare signal I want to, be the clicky, snappy part that triggers a sidechain. Do I want to be listening to it in a peak or RMS fashion? I can even set like how fast does a sidechain respond? How fast does it release to kind of create that sort of V-shaped ducking shape? You can just totally tailor and twist the sidechain input, and then this whole thing becomes a modulator that I can attach to my filter and just open it wide. And so then what would happen is every time the snare drum hits, the filter would just crank open to the amount that I set the modulator to open it to. So think about this. This is really huge. This gives you a lot of creative possibilities. You can sidechain anything to anything else. Think about that. That's huge. Okay, so just crazy, crazy sidechain capabilities. Okay, next up, the UI. I can't stand Ableton's UI. I've used it for so many years. If I sit in Ableton for 2 hours straight, my eyes are bleeding. It's washed out, it's low contrast, the text is tiny, it's hard to read. Look at how, by contrast, how warm and pretty and easy on your eyes this interface is. The colors are nicely saturated, the contrast is high, the text is very readable, everything's just beautiful. It's like you can be in Bitwig for 5 hours straight and your eyes don't get tired. You don't squint and where is that thing and drill in and lean closer to the screen and just all this stuff. And especially if you're working on a small laptop screen, this starts making a huge difference. It even has options for increasing the GUI scaling. Like if you're working on a really tiny laptop and for whatever reason you want things to be bigger, you could do this. I don't know. Can Ableton do that? I don't know. So I've never even tried, to be honest, because I always work on a big screen. But Ableton drives me nuts. Bitwig is just joy to work with. Okay, this is a really interesting one. And I'm going to do a whole video. I actually have put out one video called Demo of Fast Super Looping in Bitwig, where I kind of demonstrate this in action. But here's the deal. Let me make some more real estate. So Bitwig has a clip launcher, just like Ableton has a clip launcher. A difference is in Ableton, it's one or the other. You're either in the clip launcher or you're in the arrangement view. You're never in both. Now you can grab a clip from your arrangement view and like hold tab and start dragging it, and it will flip to your clip launcher view, and then you can drop the clip into the clip launcher or vice versa. You can use that shortcut, but it's still these two separated, disconnected screens. Bitwig lets you see them side by side, but it goes way deeper than that. Okay, these are totally integrated and can play clips separately or independently or in combination with each other. Both of these sequences are active all the time. So why is that important, you say? Well, let's say, for example, I had a MIDI clip here. Let me zoom in a little bit. Let's say I had this MIDI clip and I wasn't quite happy with it. It's in my arrangement, but it's just not working. So what I could do is hold Control, drag a copy over into my any old cell in the clip launcher. And then now I have a separate version of the clip here. And I could double click this and try some different MIDI notes, right? Try a different riff, try different timing, do whatever. I could make variations of this. I could, dupe this out and make 4 different variations of this one riff. I could even, I won't get into that. But let's just say I had 4 different melodic variations I wanted to test out. Now then I could go into this arrangement and I could say, just loop this section from here to here. Go ahead and play those 3 bars in a loop. and I want to hear my variations playing in context with everything else that's in this 3-bar loop. So these 3 other clips right here seems to be all that's in this section. And I just want to loop over and over and try these different variations and see how they sound. Now think about how you would do that in Ableton. In Ableton, you'd have to basically put these 4 clips somewhere next to or outside of the loop range you wanted to loop on, and you'd have to drag one out of the way, drag a different one into place, try that for a while, drag that one out of the way, drag another one into its place, and try that one for a while. In Bitwig, no, you don't have to do that. I can literally say, I don't want to blast your ears out, but I could start playing the arrangement, and then I could click one of these clips to launch it. And what will happen is the clip launcher sequencer will override just this one track in the arranger. And so all these other sounds would be playing from the arranger timeline, but this track would now be playing from the clips. And you could try different clips, keep jumping to each one, and you know, you could do some prototyping and testing that way, and then finally say, yeah, you know, I really like this one. That sounds better, and you can just drag it right in and replace your original in the arranger timeline. And then you could close this, and off you go. You're back in business. You can't do that in Ableton. You can't even come close to that in Ableton. And there's tons of other tricks that you can do with this tight integration between the two. I could spend 10 minutes on that alone here, just at a high level. So I'll save that for a future video. Let's move on to the next point. VST3 support. This is a big one for some of us. There are now starting to be plugins that are available only as VST3s, like the makers won't even make VST2 anymore. Ableton doesn't support VST2. What's such plugin, may you ask? Well, how about Autotune? Like, you know, Autotune Pro is a high-end, very popular plugin for vocal tracking. You can't get it in VST2. So you can't run Autotune Pro, the latest version of Autotune Pro. You can't run it in Ableton at all. Bitwig, no problem. In fact, when I use plugins in all my projects, I will always take the VST3 version if I can. And they work great. I've had no problem with them in 5 months of using Bitwig. So that's a big plus. So project management is a lot simpler and easier to wrap your head around and manage than it is in Ableton. Here's what the project view looks like in Bitwig. It's very similar to Ableton in many ways. You know, you can see all the samples that are in your project. You can see the external samples. You can see which samples are missing. You can delete any unused samples, and you can choose which ones, for example, like, no, I want to keep these 3 bounces, but it's okay, go ahead and delete all the other ones. Nothing fancy here so far. This is very much similar to Ableton. There's a nice feature where if you're just looking at all your samples, there's yellow dots that appear in this column right here. A little yellow dot will show you the external files. A little red dot will show you the missing files, or you can just get them all together in their own tabs here and then collect and save them into the project. So far that's very much like Ableton, right? The main difference between Ableton and Bitwig is in the, it has to do with the project folder itself. Ableton, since Live 10, has started creating automatic backup projects every time you press Control S to save your work. So you have a backup folder in Ableton that's constantly filling up with new projects. And the problem is, when it comes to Ableton deciding whether or not a sample or a bounce or a freeze file is needed for the project, it doesn't just look at your most recent version of the project file. It also looks at all the other versions that might be in your folder, including the stuff that's hiding up in a backup folder. And so it becomes really difficult to tell, do I really need this bounce file anymore? Do I really need this freeze file anymore? And Ableton projects will bloat up in size really fast. Like, I've had Ableton projects hitting 1 gigabyte or more because of all the backups in them. And when I say delete unused files in Ableton, it won't delete them because some old backup still needs it, right? So in Ableton, you're constantly, if you're careful and conscientious about keeping your project folders small. Like if you collaborate a lot and you want to, if you're the type of collaborator that likes to share a project with your collaborator, you don't want to be shipping these huge gigabyte project folders back and forth to each other across Dropbox, right? So you're always going into backup. You're always deleting old backups manually because Ableton won't do that for you. And it becomes really confusing when you're using Ableton's project manager to know what's safe to delete and what isn't. And if you're not really familiar with Ableton's project manager at all, you might be really confused why your project is huge. Like I get questions from people all the time, like, why is my project so huge? I'm trying to send a copy of it to a collaborator, and yet it's like 750 megabytes. Why? There's hardly anything in it. And that's why. So in Bitwig, it's a little more straightforward. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Less of a headache to deal with your project management. Okay, and then the last big pro about Bitwig is this ability to access multi-output channels from a plugin. So this is for people like if you like to use Machine, or if you like to use, I like to use VPS Avenger, which also has multiple outs. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but the basic idea is, let me just create a new track real quick and demo it. I'm going to drop Avenger in this track. So if you're not familiar with VPS Avenger, it's a great synth. I love it. Hello. It's a kind of a DAW inside of a synthesizer. And what I mean by that is you can add tons and tons of different oscillators of all kinds of different types. It's got everything from granular synthesis oscillators to voltage, analog voltage style wave shapes, to wave tables, to just samples and resamples and stuff like that. So it's got tons of crazy oscillators in it, but it also has a drum kit built inside of it. And I actually really like their drum kit because the drum sequencer is pretty fun to work with. And let's just go into some random kit and load up a pattern from it. So this sequencer, once you wrap your head around it, it's a very short learning curve. It's really fast to work in. And I like to often prototype things in here. The problem is it's inside of a single VST, right? So if I were to want to do any type of serious mixing of the drum sounds inside of this one instance of Avenger, well, in Ableton, you can't, it's really hard to do that. Like in Ableton, you would be tempted to somehow copy the MIDI clip out of Avenger, which is easy to do. You can just right click down here and say export to MIDI. So I could bounce this MIDI out easily enough and then adjust it. And there's a fairly simple way to get the actual samples out of it if you wanted to use these same exact samples in your drum kit in Ableton. You know, you can do it, but it's a process. It's many steps. Now, by contrast, in Bitwig, any kind of plugin that has multiple output buses or channels, it will display this little double arrow thing that basically says, hey, this plugin has outputs. Do you want to expose them here in Bitwig? And so if I say, sure, add all those outputs, now I have individual channels. And in any one of these channels, like this bass drum channel, I could start adding VSTs to process it, like, or presets. Like sometimes I like to shape my drum racks, my drum samples with some specialized compression. This is a multi-band shaper of a drum sample. I won't go into how it works, but it's a trick that I use to give them a nice transient shape if they're a squashed sausage to begin with. That's a technique I learned from Il Gates. So the point is I can expose all of these sound channels that are inside of a VST. I can add processing to them. I can mix them independently let's see, where is that guy? Here at the end. Okay, so here's that VPS Avenger track. And here are individual mix faders and pan knobs and solos and mutes for all of the different channels coming out of that VST. It's fabulous. In fact, that song I played for you at the beginning of this, I never took the drums out of Avenger. They sounded great in Avenger. I did some additional processing on them in Bitwig. I mixed them in Bitwig, but I never had to like move the MIDI out of Avenger or move the drum samples out of Avenger. In Ableton, I couldn't do this. So that saved me a huge amount of time and made that project go a lot faster. Okay, so those are the top advantages of Bitwig. That's what you're going to gain if you move to Bitwig. Now, what are you going to lose? What are the cons compared to Ableton, right? I'm not talking about other DAWs. There's not, in my mind, a compelling reason for a person who loves Studio One or who loves Logic or who loves Pro Tools or who loves Fruity Loops even. Those are great DAWs for other genres of music. But if you're in a genre of music that really benefits from all the features in Ableton, that's the kind of person who might really seriously consider Bitwig. So from the standpoint of moving from Ableton to Bitwig, what do you lose? What are the cons? Well, a big, big con is no support for audio unit plugins. All you Mac people who prefer to use audio units, don't even think about Bitwig. They don't have support for that. I don't think they ever plan to have support for that. They're very big into the open. They always want to have Bitwig be able to be run on Windows, OS X, and Unix. And the one VST, the one plugin type that plays nicely across all those platforms is VST. So I wouldn't hold your breath for this. If you love your audio units, don't even think about Bitwig. It's just a simple fact. Okay. Warping. Up until version 2.3, which came out about 4 months ago, up until version 2.3 of Bitwig, you could make a really strong argument that Bitwig wasn't worth moving to because its warping was bad. And you know what? That's true. But now the warping is awesome, especially for any kind of clean warping. Like if I look at this clip and actually I want to just see it that way. The warping is done in this section here, and there's different algorithms, lots of them. And in 2.3, they finally introduced the same Elastique engine that Ableton has been using for a while. It's a French company called Elastique. And these are great warping algorithms. I will even argue that Bitwig's implementation of the Elastique algorithms is cleaner and better than Ableton's. Yes, I said it. This Elastique Pro algorithm is nothing like Ableton's Complex Pro. It's a different beast. This thing works great on drums. It is so clean on drums and heavily transient tracks. It's also really clean on vocals or chords or any kind of like more melodic and sustained material. It's just an all-purpose, really strong, clean warping algorithm that has very few artifacts in it unless you stretch, too far. And I love it. This is the one I go to all the time. It's also not a hard hit on the CPU like Ableton's Complex Pro is. So this is 99% of the time. This is the one algorithm I grab now when I want to do clean stretching. Okay. Then there's all these other stretch modes. Some of these are older. These were the ones that people thought were kind of icky and not so good. And the problem is these are all attempts to be basically clean stretching algorithms. Some of them use a spectral technique. Some of them use a granular technique, just like Ableton has a mix of spectral and granular warping techniques. But what Bitwig still doesn't have are the two warping modes in Ableton that a lot of us use for creative sound mangling. And we use them a lot. And those two specific warping algorithms are texture and tones. You can do crazy things with these warping algorithms. You can resample a sound, throw one of these algorithms on it, slow the speed way down by kicking the tempo up to like $999, and you get crazy sounds out of it that you can use in electronic music. So you will miss these. There's nothing like it at the track level in Bitwig. However, there is something to kind of make up for that. And that's best exemplified if we go stick sampler on a track. Actually, I may have a deactivated thing here. Yeah, I do. So this track here, I don't know, can I play it? Let's find out. Does that sound familiar? That sounds an awful lot like messing with texture warping in Ableton, right? So what's going on here is, and I'll go into this in way more detail when I do my video on the sampler, but I had this mid-bass sound that is MIDI. I quickly just bounced it out to audio, and then I dragged this audio clip into sampler. So this audio right here just basically was done in about 10 seconds, starting with this MIDI clip. So here's what the original sound sounds like, the original clip that I dropped into the sampler. Okay, that's all it is. Kind of nice, low, fat, bassy sound. And then here, I'm using one of the creative warping modes, and the keyword is creative, right? This is where you get your creative warping, is inside of sampler, the new 2.4 sampler that's about to be put into production. This is a beta version of Bitwig I'm showing you. And it's got different styles of creative warping textures. And this one called textures is almost identical to Ableton's texture warping mode. It's just that it's inside of the sampler, not at the track level. Okay. And so when I say it's just like Ableton, you've got a grain control that's very wide. You've got a motion control for randomizing and spreading out the grains as they move around. And you've got a pitch, like a time control here. And so I just threw a couple oscillators on some of these controls, and then I froze the playhead. You can freeze the playhead or let it free run. Like this is if the playhead isn't frozen. And then if I freeze the playhead, and this control is now manually moving the playhead around, and then I've got an LFO also wobbling it around wherever it's set, you can do this kind of stuff. Okay, so you're not going to miss textures that much once you get used to the new sampler and you start playing with this one creative warping mode. The cyclic one is pretty good too. The repitch one is good too, but this is my favorite. So that's a downside. There's no texture and tone warping. Of course, if you still have Ableton, you can always, if you really want to, just bounce a track out to audio, bounce your master out to audio, open up Ableton. You can have Ableton open at the same time. You can drop that stem into Ableton. You can do your creative warping there, export that stem and just pull it back into Bitwig and move on. So it's not that big of a loss unless you just never had Ableton to begin with. Okay, the next thing you're missing is no MP3 export. Of course, Ableton didn't have MP3 export either until Live 10, so that may or may not be a loss. Most of us had other ways of getting things converted to MP3. A very tiny, tiny difference is that Ableton has a few different dithering options when you're burning masters. Bitwig only has one triangular option, which honestly is the best option anyway, but it's kind of a black box. They don't tell you what sort of noise shaping they're using, or even if they are using noise shaping. So if you're careful and meticulous about your dithering and your dithering options, you're probably going to want a third-party dithering tool. And in fact, I always have used a third-party dithering tool since it came out, called Master Dither by Kazrog. I love this. I think this K2 noise shaping is great, and triangular with K2 noise shaping and auto blanking is always the way I go for my masters. So no big loss. This is like a $10 or $20 plugin. Let's see, Simpler. So Bitwig Sampler can also do almost everything that Simpler does, except for one thing. Simpler has a button in it that says warp, and it will do clean warping of any sample you drag into it, you know, up to a certain point outside of its original tempo. Bitwig doesn't have anything like that. Can't sugarcoat that. If you want clean warping, the only way to do it with Bitwig Sampler is to do something like take a clip you want, drag it into some empty audio track, use the clean warping modes here, like Elastic Pro, to pre-warp the sample or the clip where you want it, get it set up the way you want it, and then just drag that resampled and warped clip back into the sampler, okay? So it's not the end of the world. It's a little less convenient than Simpler, which just lets you drag any old clip in and then click the warp button, and then boom, it's gonna warp kind of cleanly for you without thinking about it too much. That's a nice thing. So there's nothing quite like that in Bitwig. There's also nothing quite like the ease of use in Simpler's slicing mode. Bitwig does allow you to slice to multi-sample and stick it right into a sampler. Like this is like let's say I wanted to take this one clip. I can do something called slice to multi-sample and choose different ways to slice it, whether it's on specific note divisions or bars or at, they call transient markers, they call them onsets in Bitwig. So I could split it at the transient markers. And so you can choose a value, like let's say I pick onsets, and then you can even choose like, well, how many slices do you want out of it? And it'll pick, you know, 41 of those onsets in that big 8-bar sample, 4-bar sample. And it'll split it and toss it into a new multi-sampler. It's telling me, well, actually, based on the number of onsets I'm finding in that clip, you say make as many as 41, but I only found 30, right? So it tells you what it's going to do to some extent. And then if I do this, it's going to create an entirely new track with a sampler. All the slices are loaded in as a multi-sample here. Here's kind of a bigger view of the multi-sampler. And, you know, there you go. You've got slices, and you know the key range that's going to play each slice. And you can change, of course, the zones and ranges just like in Ableton. And it also predefines MIDI that will just play through those slices sequentially one by one. So you can do some of the same things as Simpler, just not as easily. Because in Simpler, it's like you don't have to bounce it and get a new MIDI clip and deal with all that stuff. In Simpler, you can just drop in a sample and just twist that resolution knob for the slices and experiment until you find something you like. So if you use this feature a lot, if you use this feature of Simpler a lot, you're going to miss it. And finally, there's nothing, absolutely nothing in Bitwig that does anything remotely like Ableton's awesome convert harmony, melody, or MIDI, harmony, melody, or drums to a MIDI track. There just isn't. If you want to do that, you're going to have to take an audio clip over to Ableton, do it there, and then bring your MIDI clips back into Bitwig. And then finally, well, not finally, two more. It's not easy to collect external samples into a project, but say don't bring in external samples from the user library. And that's really important for those of us who use a lot of 128s. Okay, if you're familiar with what 128s are, it's a sampler loaded up with 128 different individual samples. And we like to use them in things like drum racks and all kinds of other contexts, some of us. And in Ableton, you can tell it when it's collecting files. You can say, do not collect files from the user library. And so it won't drag in all those 128s from your user library and bloat up your project folder with tons and tons of samples that you don't need in the project folder because they live in your user library and they're always there. Bitwig, unfortunately, has no way to just automatically exclude things that are coming from the user library. It is a little bit of pain in the ass. I keep putting in feature requests with Bitwig saying you really need to give us this ability because of 128s and other reasons. So hopefully someday they'll add this, but right now they don't. So you have to get a little creative in the way that you collect files into your folder, into your project folder, and archive a project if you use a lot of 128s. It's not like you can't work around it, but it's a pain to work around. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. Okay, and then finally, this is kind of a minor one, but it may bug some of you. When you're playing a track in Bitwig, come on, let's close a couple things down here. Don't want you anymore. Zoom out. I'm trying to go to a point where I haven't put in lots of crazy changes to the project. So if I play this and I go over to my mixer view, pay attention to the ballistics on the mixers. Oops, why is my sound no longer working? Ah, because I'm solo. Okay.
My name is Baphometrix. I bring you the message.
Okay, so if you pay really close attention, you're going to see that the peak indicators, the little thin lines, and then the solid bars, the top of which indicates RMS, the ballistics on them are really fast. They decay too fast. So if you watch, it's really hard to see an exact, like, where is the peak generally sitting and where is the RMS generally sitting? They bounce up and down too fast. They wiggle too fast. So I feel like the ballistics in Bitwig aren't nearly as nice as the ballistics in Ableton. One more time.
My name is Baphometrix.
Okay, so you can get used to that and it's still good enough, but I find myself sometimes grabbing a third-party metering plugin when I want to get more specific values beyond just the standard what is the max peak that track hit. If I want to really like get a close look at the RMS, or I want to really see how much that peak tends to jump around and where it wants to average as opposed to what its max value is, the ballistics in Ableton are a little bit better. And I miss that a little bit. I like the Ableton track meters a lot. These are nice. They're just different and a little weak in this one respect. So that's the main set of pros and cons. If any of these are deal killers for you, you shouldn't think about Bitwig. Now there's another thing to look at in this document. I'm not going to talk over them here. You can just read them on your own. Again, the link for this will be in the description for the video, the comments for the video. But there's these three sections that talk about like, what are the things Bitwig has that Ableton doesn't? Like what instruments, what kind of special operations, and what kind of devices. There's, a table that says what exactly does Ableton have that Bitwig doesn't? And then what are the features that are the same in both DAWs? Now, this table is the other one you may want to look at really, really carefully because these are things in Ableton that have no corresponding analog over in Bitwig. Like I already talked about the convert harmony, melody, and drums to MIDI. I don't think most people care about these 5 instruments. I never use them. But you may miss some of these special audio processing devices and MIDI processing devices. AutoPan is nice. We use it a lot. You're going to have a third-party plugin to kind of duplicate some of this behavior. Some people are in love with the new drum bus. Yeah, it's pretty good. There's other third-party plugins you can use to do this. Bitwig's device that they call Tree Monster can do that, but it's a thing. If you love drum bus, maybe you want to hesitate about moving to Bitwig. Glue compressor. Everyone loves glue compressor, but honestly, that's not a huge loss because there's tons and tons of SSLG emulations out there, and some of them are pretty cheap. Like you can always find this one on Waves for only 29 bucks, and arguably it sounds better than Ableton's glue compressor. What else? Some people really love overdrive. Some people really love saturator. I love saturator. There's no Bitwig analog. Bitwig has a distortion, a couple types of distortion and bit crushing plugins, but it doesn't have anything that's just kind of that in-between thing we call saturator. So if you love saturator and use it all the time, you are going to miss it. And you're going to have to figure out which third-party plugin like Saturn or Trash or whatever, or some random stomp box effect from Native Instruments or whatever. You're going to have to find a different way to do your saturation. Tuner. Some people love Tuner. There's nothing like that. You're going to need a third-party thing for Bitwig. Vocoder. Some people love vocoder. There isn't any native vocoder in Bitwig yet, but some users have built, like, let's go to the browser here. A user called, where are you, Taika Kim? Taika Kim, this is actually a pack of special racks that you can download from inside Bitwig itself. They're like distributed through Bitwig. It's a special effects pack. And they actually built a pretty good, pretty crazy and complex rack. It looks like this. It looks very simple on the surface, and it's actually a pretty passable vocoder in many ways. But someone had to build it the hard way using native Ableton devices and modulators. And it's just, if you dig into this, it's incredibly deep and complex, but it works well. So, there are some options like this, or you could buy a third-party VST vocoder, but that's that. So that's all I have for you today. Thanks for hanging with me so far. Again, if you can look over this whole document. I'm going to be going into a lot of the other contents of this document in other videos later, talking about how to do all kinds of stuff. And I'm going to go into a lot more detail about those 12 pros and cons. And I guess the last thing I would ask is, if you found this video useful and you find this document useful, please like and subscribe me on YouTube, but also do me a solid and give me a follow on SoundCloud and Spotify too. It would mean a lot to me. Follower count is important for some of us, especially those of us newer and trying to get some recognition. So, hey, help me out. Okay, that's all. Thanks for hanging with me. Bye-bye.